Arguing is easy. I mean, we do it all the time. But arguing well, that's a little tougher. And arguing like a philosopher, now that's ambitious. But you're in the right place, because today I'm going to show you how philosophers think about arguments so that you can learn to argue like a philosopher and maybe even think like a philosopher about arguments. Okay, so what is an argument? Well, I made a video about this before, but just for a quick recap, an argument is a main point that's backed up by evidence. It is a conclusion that is supported by premises. That's what we mean by argument. So when philosophers think about arguments, we think about three things: the premises, the conclusion, and the relationship of support that goes between them. So here's a simple example of an argument. It's raining outside, therefore you should bring an umbrella. The premise is that it's raining outside, and the conclusion is that you should bring an umbrella. And the support is that feeling that makes you think that the premise gives us extra reason to believe the conclusion. That because it's raining outside, I should bring my umbrella. Now here's a more complex example. Premise 1. If you don't learn how to use AI effectively, you won't be able to get a job in the new economy. Premise 2. You can either get a job in the new economy, or you can starve to death. Premise 3. You don't want to starve to death, right? So therefore, you should probably learn how to use AI effectively. Now this argument will take a little bit more work to analyze, because it's not really clear if the premises really work to support the conclusion. By the end of the video, you'll understand what needs to be done to figure out if the argument is good, if the premises support the conclusion. So when philosophers analyze arguments, they care about two things. First is if the premises are true, and second is if they support the conclusion. We'll first focus on evaluating the premises. Now we obviously want our premises to be true, and sometimes this is easy to see. When it is, this makes argument analysis a little bit easier. False premises, on the other hand, should be avoided, obviously. Now the problem is there's lots of wiggle room between obviously true and obviously false premises. Questionable premises are difficult to decide if they're either true or false. And premises can be questionable for a variety of reasons. On the one hand, they could be subjective, matters of preference, like cake tastes better than pie or something. On the other hand, they could be empirical, but unverifiable, meaning there is an answer to the question, but we just don't know it. And maybe we can never know it, like the number of stars in the universe or the number of hairs on my head. These are verifiable in principle, there's a number for both of those things, but we just don't have access to it. Another kind of questionable premise is a premise about values, so whether or not something is morally right or wrong. These aren't because they're subjective. Maybe you think that morality is objective, and that's fine. The problem is that values are things about which reasonable people can disagree. And if reasonable people can disagree about them, then reasonable people might not accept your argument, and that's not good. So we want arguments with obviously true premises, no false premises, and we want to avoid or mitigate questionable premises to the best of our ability. Okay, so those are premises, and we want to evaluate the truth of premises when we're evaluating arguments. But the other thing that philosophers care about when they're evaluating arguments is the idea of support, because the premises have to support the conclusion. True premises aren't enough for a good argument. For example, I could give the argument that squares have 4 sides, therefore you should bring an umbrella. Now the premise is true, the conclusion may or may not be true, but this is a bad argument because the premise doesn't actually support the conclusion. Premises have to support the conclusion, meaning that they have to give us reason to believe the conclusion. The goal for a good argument should be that if the premises are true, the conclusion is more likely to be true, or maybe even guaranteed to be true. Now argument support comes on a spectrum. The best arguments give the most support. So the main way of dividing argument types is into inductive arguments or deductive arguments. Deductive arguments give absolute support for their conclusions. If the premises of a deductive argument are true, then the conclusion has to be true. It would be impossible for a situation to occur where the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. Arguments that are like this are called deductively valid. Now, a deductively valid argument doesn't have to have true premises. What makes it deductively valid is that if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. So for example, my argument might be that I'm taller than Jenny, and Jenny is taller than Steve. Therefore, I am taller than Steve. Now, it doesn't matter who Jenny, Steve, or even I am in this example. The point is that if the premises were true, if it were the case that I were taller than Jenny and Jenny were taller than Steve, then I would, by pure logic, have to be taller than Steve. That's what a deductive argument means. Or to take another example, all whales are mammals. Belugas are whales. Therefore, belugas are mammals. This argument is deductively valid because if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. And in fact, this argument helps us notice something about deductive arguments, namely that they're usually deductively valid by virtue of their form alone. What this means is that when we're dealing with deductively valid logical forms, the content of the argument doesn't actually matter. So here's another example. You're either with me or you're my enemy. You're not with me, therefore you're my enemy. Now this argument is deductively valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. But this argument is valid by virtue of its form. Any argument that follows this pattern is going to be deductively valid. And the deductively valid pattern looks like this. Premise 1, either W or E. Premise 2, not W, therefore E. This logical form is called a disjunctive syllogism because it's formed by a disjunction and the negation of one of the items in the disjunction, which we call the disjunct. There are many different deductively valid logical forms, like modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, constructive dilemma, destructive dilemma, reductio ad absurdum, and many others. Usually this is a whole class for any philosophy major. And philosophers who practice with these are really good at identifying them in the wild. And philosophers also prefer to use them when they can in their own arguments because of the fact that they are deductively valid, and they give absolute support for their conclusions. The other type of argument is inductive. And this is when the premises give us reason to believe the conclusion without guaranteeing that it's true. Most everyday arguments are inductive. Most of the time when we are arguing about or for something, we're giving reasons that don't necessitate the absolute certainty of the conclusion that we're trying to argue for. Now, inductive arguments involve many different types of arguments, because they cover pretty much the whole spectrum of support from 1% all the way up to 99%. Anything that's not a deductive argument or not an argument at all is going to be an inductive argument. So any argument involving probability is going to be an inductive argument. Like, polling says Obama has a 70% chance of winning. Therefore, Obama is going to win the election. The polling data here gives us some reason to believe the conclusion, but it definitely doesn't guarantee it. Also, arguments about causation and correlation are going to be inductive. Arguments from authority are also inductive arguments. Now, there are lots of other kinds of inductive arguments too. Maybe you know a couple. Put them in the comments if so, and I'll talk about them in a later video. But the main thing with inductive arguments is that in each of these cases, even if the premise is true, the conclusion might still be false, and we're not breaking any logical rules. Okay, so as I said, when we evaluate arguments, we need to look at both of these things, the truth of the premises and the support that they give to the conclusion. Now, the order in which you approach each of these topics doesn't actually matter. I just go with whatever's easiest. Sometimes it's pretty obvious when you have a false premise. Other times it's a little less obvious and you might just want to put a question mark next to a questionable premise and then analyze something else, like a different premise or the support. So the first thing I like to check for is whether an argument is inductive or deductive. Sometimes you can tell this just based on the topic. So like statistics or medicine or science generally is going to deal with inductive arguments. Other times you can just identify logical forms from a distance. You can just see that the argument has the shape of a certain kind of syllogism or a certain kind of deductively valid logical form. And if you can spot those, you can simplify the process a little bit by then just moving right to evaluating whether or not the premises are true. But if it's not a deductive argument, then it's an inductive argument. And I'll have to start thinking in terms of degrees of confidence and the quality of the evidence and how much support the premises can give to the conclusion, because I know it's not a guarantee. But if you can't spot deductively valid argument forms, there is a way of testing to see whether an argument is deductively valid. As we said, a deductively valid argument needs premises that guarantee the truth of the conclusion, meaning that there's no possible situation in which you have true premises, but a false conclusion. So a good way to test this is to assume that the conclusion is false, and then see if this leads to any contradictions within the premises. So here's a simple example. Premise 1, it's raining outside. Premise 2, if it's raining outside, you should bring an umbrella. Conclusion, you should bring an umbrella. Now, is this argument deductively valid? Well, one way to test is to figure out if the premises can coexist alongside the false conclusion. So how do we test this? We make the conclusion false, you should not bring an umbrella, and see if that ends up contradicting anything in the premises. So if it's true that we should not bring an umbrella, then by virtue of premise 2, it can't be raining outside. Because if it were, then we would have to have an umbrella. But if we don't have an umbrella, then we can infer that it's not raining. But if premise 2 says it's not raining, and premise 1 says it is raining, then we have a contradiction. So we can't have a false conclusion with true premises in this argument. Therefore, it must be deductively valid. And that's it. That's the basics of understanding arguments like a philosopher. That's what philosophers do. They look at arguments in terms of their premises, their conclusions, and the support that the premises give to the conclusions. That's pretty much all philosophers do about any philosophical topic you can think of. But you don't just have to be a philosopher to use these skills. You can analyze any argument on any topic using the skills that we've discussed here today. And doing so is really good for your thinking in general, and for your relationships with others. Thinking more clearly about arguments helps us be more rational in general. It makes our ideas clearer, and it makes us more easily able to analyze the views of others. Focusing on arguments also helps us keep focused on the issues that we're discussing, not the people talking about the issues. And this also reduces our chance of unproductive conversations, personal attacks, and just all-around nastiness. So learning your way around arguments could make for smoother social interactions in your daily life. And that's about it. Be sure to like and subscribe for more Frank Philosophy.